Today I'm going to make some fruited scones, or scones if you prefer, and we're going to serve them in the form of a cream tea. If the term cream tea is a little bit unfamiliar to you, hopefully it will become clear later on. Now, of course, I didn't invent scones, so it's perfectly fine to use someone else's recipe. In fact, that's what everybody does now. So I'm using the BBC Good Food recipe for this, which I'll link in the video description. Got 350 grams of self-raising flour, into which I've added a teaspoon of baking powder. If you've only got plain flour, you could just add an extra teaspoon, maybe a teaspoon and a half of baking powder to your plain flour, so 2.5 teaspoons in total. Next, I need 85 grams of butter, which I'll cut up into cubes, just really to make it easier to rub in a moment. We're going to do a rubbing in method, which is quite common for crumbly pastry type of baked items. I'm using unsalted butter here, so if you used salted butter, you might want to cut back on the added salt that happens in just a moment. Right, there we go. That's up to 87 grams, but near enough. Now you can combine the butter and flour just by rubbing it together in between your fingertips. So just crushing the chunks of butter until they combine with the flour, just lightly crushing them like this between your fingertips, just repeating a sort of squeezing action to combine the flour into the fat. And that will work perfectly fine. Takes a bit longer than what I'm going to do, which is use a pastry blender tool. If you've got a food processor, you can perhaps do the rubbing in with that by just pulsing gently. Got to go careful with that though, because that can sometimes overmix, and actually the agitation and speed might melt the butter, and you might end up with something that isn't kind of crumbly, but it's rather melted in. So what we've got now is a mixture that looks kind of like breadcrumbs, but actually just really looks like lumpy flour, with no conspicuous or large lumps of butter visible now. Next, 3 tablespoons of caster sugar, and then I've got 85 grams of sultanas, which are raisins made with green sultana grapes. They're just like a lighter coloured raisin really, often a little bit more moist and sweeter than standard raisins. And a pinch of salt, which is about 1/4 teaspoonful. Now I'm just going to completely and thoroughly combine those. The recipe I'm following today doesn't call for this, but I like it, so I'm going to use the zest of 1 lemon in here as well. This is an unwaxed lemon. If you're going to eat the skin, it is best if you can find unwaxed lemons. And I've just got this zester tool, which is just very convenient for taking off just the outer layer of the rind. You can use a grater if you go carefully, and just so that doesn't form kind of stringy pieces, and so that it distributes evenly throughout the dough, I'm just going to chop it into smaller pieces. That will also help the flavour come out. These scones are only going to be baked for 10 minutes, so smaller pieces of lemon zest will give more flavour. So in goes the lemon zest, and again I'm just going to mix that through. So that's all the dry ingredients. Now I've got 175 ml of milk, which I've allowed to come to room temperature. And then into that milk I'm going to add the juice of half a lemon, which will curdle the milk, but that's not a problem. About a teaspoonful of vanilla extract, and then the milk and lemon, which actually has curdled. How about that? I'm just going to use a knife to mix that all together. It will appear quite a soft, wet dough, but that isn't a problem. Now onto the pastry surface, a generous dusting of flour, because it's quite a sticky dough. And then we'll turn out that dough onto there. And then lots of flour on my hands. And now here's where I deviate from the recipe, because the recipe says to fold it over a couple of times. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to squeeze it like that, and squeeze it like that, and then leave it in one piece. And that means my scones are going to come out really, really crumbly, but that's what I want. I'm not going to roll it. I'm not going to use a pastry cutter, because this pastry cutter might just smear the edges of the dough, and that will prevent a rise. Just going to trim off the edges. I will clump these scraps into one piece and we'll get a kind of misshape, but that'll give us a little taste. And then I'm going to make square scones, 9 of them. So I just cut twice that way. Quiet, Eva. And twice that way. And that's it. Oven is now preheating to 160C fan. Just a really quick note, these are only going to be cooked for like 10 or 12 minutes at 160. That's a really, really light bake. And they're going to come out looking quite pale. And that is by design. I want scones that are just on the point of being cooked, because that will mean that they retain a little bit of moisture at the same time as being really crumbly. If you want to cook your scones for 20 minutes and have golden tops and have them a bit drier inside, then more power to you. I'm going to cook these as lightly as I possibly can on purpose. So a very lightly oiled baking tray. I'm just going to pick those up and drop them on there. And they are almost falling apart. So there we go, we've got 9 kind of intact ones which have been cut. And I'm just going to do this one. It'll be a bit like a rock cake really, but I'll just kind of gently squish it together into a round. And that's all the little scraps and trimmings. And that will go there. The recipe says to egg wash them, and I've always just used milk for scones. And then these go into an oven at a lower than usual temperature, 160 Celsius fan or 140 static, for just probably 10 to 12 minutes. Right, I think that'll be enough. And what we can do here, we can actually just test these in the same way that you would test a cake. Just stick a toothpick in. If it comes out clean, we're done. So a few points about these. Obviously if you use an egg wash and if you bake for a little bit longer, you'll get a more brown top. That won't really matter for how we're going to serve these, because they're going to be split and then topped. So the other thing to note is Americans watching this might be saying, these are biscuits. And yeah, they pretty much are. There are some differences in the recipe, like biscuits might use buttermilk. I think biscuits might be kneaded a little bit more than scones, but then this recipe did call for kneading as well. So yeah, they are very similar, and I don't know whether American biscuits are descended from scones. Scones are certainly very ancient, but I think it's also probably one of those things where if you've got butter and flour and milk, scones or biscuits or whatever are kind of the obvious thing that you will end up making. So it might be one of these things that's been invented and reinvented and rediscovered a dozen times. So also, yeah, these are really rustic. If you want really neat and tidy scones, knead them a little bit more and use a pastry cutter like this one. Now they've had a minute or two cooling, they can be transferred onto a wire rack to cool further. If you try and do that when they're hot out of the oven, they will probably fall apart. Just to mention as well, this video is a collaboration with my friend Babatunde in Nigeria, who wanted to make scones. So this is me making a very standard scone. I don't know whether he's going to adapt the recipe or anything. He may have to because of available ingredients out there in Nigeria. His video will be in this card and in the video description. Now while these are cooling down, that just gives me time to dash out and get 2 essential ingredients. Okay, right, let's head back to Atomic Shrimp HQ and put this all together. We're not going to do fancy teacups or anything like that, so tea for Jenny, Earl Grey tea for me. Right, let's give these a try. So these are really, really delicate and crumbly because of how I've cooked them. They may look undercooked to you, but they are this way by design, as I say. And in order to get this to split, I'm just going to carefully jab it all the way around. And there we go. Look at that. That, in my opinion, is the best kind of scone. Still ever so slightly tender, but completely light and cooked. So what is a cream tea? Well, there are 2 areas of Britain that regard themselves as the authority on this matter, and they don't agree. They agree that it's scones and jam and cream, but they disagree on the order in which it goes. So I've got some nice strawberry jam here. In Cornwall, it's jam first with cream on top. And I've got clotted cream here, which in a previous video I think I said that I thought this was cultured, but actually it's just reduced. It's just like cream that's been heated in a double boiler until it goes almost chewy sort of texture, almost like, well, it's like halfway between butter and very thick cream. So yeah, in Cornwall, it's jam first and cream on top. In Devon, it's cream first with jam on top. And apparently, this distinction is very, very important. Now, you might think this is something almost like out of Gulliver's Travels, but some people take this really seriously. I'm not sure whether they do that just to define themselves, or maybe it's a shibboleth so you can recognise your countrymen or recognise an outlander. Who knows? Anyway, but these are the two key varieties of cream tea: the Cornwall jam first cream and Devon cream first jam. They do vary a little bit in the proportions actually of each of those ingredients, and I'm sure I probably haven't got this right. But anyway, let's get stuck in. So I'll take a bite of each one in no particular order because I'm not sure I have a preference. Right, here goes. Okay. Wow. What do you think, Jenny?
Oh, yeah.
Good. The Devon style. I mean, I can see how people would have a preference, but that's just me. Neither of these two things seemed mechanically better than the other. The one that had the jam on top, I ended up eating all of the jam before the cream. The one that had the cream on top, the opposite happened, so I can't express any design preference. Let's see if I can actually decide which way I would do it for the next one. Okay, I have made a decision, and remember, this is not a decision about which one's best, this is just a decision about which one I prefer. So for me, and I'm sorry Cornwall, I hope there's no offence taken, there's certainly none intended, I think I prefer the Devon version, just my personal preference. It just seems to make a little bit more sense to me to spread the cream on the scone, because the cream's a bit more like butter. But don't let that stop you doing what you want to do, of course. You aren't going to. Those were the type of scones I might make for a cream tea. Pale and delicate and mild and so tender and crumbly you literally need two hands to eat them. But what if you fancy something a bit more robust? Well, I'm glad you asked, because now we're going to make cheese scones. It's a very similar recipe: 350 grams of self-raising flour, an extra teaspoonful of baking powder, a teaspoonful of salt, a little bit more salt this time because we're making savoury scones, 2 teaspoonsful of English mustard powder. You could just use mustard from a jar there, or hot sauce if you want. Mix those dry ingredients together a little bit. And as before, 85 grams of cold butter, which will break into little cubes or chunks. A little bit more. There we go, 85 grams of butter. And as before, I'm going to use the pastry blender tool to rub that fat into the flour. Okay, we're there. So yeah, we've got a nicely blended fat and flour mix there. And now back onto the scales because I need to add the cheese. This is Red Leicester. It's a medium cheese. I was going to use Double Gloucester. Double Gloucester's another similar cheese, quite a lot more rich and buttery than this. But Red Leicester has the colour. We'll make this what it is. Right, that's 75 grams. I'm just going to mix that in so it doesn't form an enormous clump. And I want 125 grams of cheese. That's quite a lot of cheese, but you know, we're making cheese scones, we might as well make them taste of cheese. There we go, 125 grams, or thereabouts. Cheese and scone mix together. I'm going to mix that cheese in before we add the liquid. 175 ml of room temperature milk. I just warmed this slightly in the microwave, but you can just leave the milk out if you've got time and let it come to room temperature. If you put cold milk in, the scones might not rise quite so well. Now with this one, we're not going to go for the kind of falling apart crumbly texture. So I am going to not knead this, but I'm going to fold it. So just bring the dough together in the bowl till we get to the point where there's no pocket of dry flour at the bottom. That's far enough. And again, well floured pastry surface, and we'll have all of that dough out in a lump or heap. And again, floured hands. I'm not going to knead it because that will destroy those strands of cheese, but I'm not going to be so delicate with this one. We are going to make this into a dough, and we are going to cut it with the round cutter. So I just need to squeeze it together until it's coherent, like this. Okay. Now, and the reason I'm doing this is because these scones, I want them to be a little bit stronger. I want them to be a little bit tougher so that they can be buttered. Because yes, there isn't already enough butter and cheese in here. So a little bit of flour, a little bit of rolling, like that, and fold. And those dry bits there, we'll just get them in. Don't worry about that, they will incorporate. And same at the other end. And then I'm going to turn it. And any of these dry bits, we'll just put them on top instead of flour. So rolled it, turned it that way. I'm going to roll again. So it's a bit like rough puff pastry in the sense that we are trying to create a little bit of lamination here. Again, into the middle and into the middle. And now just going to straighten up the sides, because this is the final roll. About 3.5 centimeters thick maybe, and the pastry cutter this time. I think I'm going to get 4 out of here. You can get hexagonal scone cutters, and I probably should invest in one. Okay, and then quickly down. Like that. Take the trimmings away. We will re-roll those, but they will not be as good as these first 4. Those go onto a lightly oiled baking tray while we figure out what to do with these remnants. And that's just going to be minimal re-rolling just to get it together. The scraps will tend to not stick because it's quite an oily dough. And this last little bit, rather than try and roll it and cut it, I'm just going to push it down into the pastry cutter like this to get it roughly the right shape. Push it through and we'll bake it that way up. Right, a little bit of a tidy up and then we'll get those in the oven. Now I'm going to egg wash these as well, but also for a couple of them I'm just going to put some dried chili flakes on top. These are actually chilies that I bought fresh, and if you don't put chilies in the fridge, especially small ones, and just leave them out, they will naturally dry themselves, and that's what these have done. So still completely usable. These are little bird chilies. So a couple of them will get some spicy on top. Not all of them, because Jenny's not a fan of chili. Tiny pinch of salt in the egg wash, because that will help the egg to relax a little bit. Oven thrumming away in the background. Just a tiny little bit more cheese, mostly as a garnish. So these two here, which is the last roll, the really wonky one, and the second roll, the semi-wonky one, are going to get a tiny smattering of chili flakes. Just those two. And then a little bit of cheese, just a tiny amount, just to hold that in place. And I'm going to put just a few strands of cheese on all of the others. Maybe I'll leave one of them uncheesed. And then the egg wash, and this is kind of difficult actually. I probably should have done egg wash and then cheese and then more egg wash. The first little dab seems to lift the cheese, but a little bit more egg seems to do the trick. And I will do my chili ones last. So that's the one that's got no additional cheese on. Just give that an egg wash. So this time the oven's going on 180°C fan, which is a little bit hotter, and that's a more conventional cooking temperature. And these will probably be in there for 15 to maybe 18 minutes until they're really nice and golden. And of course I am waiting for the oven to come up to temperature. And there they are. Nicely golden. I'm just going to let those cool a little bit before we try to transfer them onto a rack. They will probably sink down a little bit. These two here have risen so nicely. Let's do a little time lapse and see if those actually sink down a little bit when they come out of the oven. Now as I get these onto a rack for cooling, you can really see the difference between, well, these are the ones which were cut after the first roll. These are the ones which were cut after re-rolling, and this is the last one that was made from scraps. It's broken a little bit when I took it off the tray, but that means we can taste it a little bit. Good. This, I hope, illustrates what I keep on labouring about not overworking the dough. So this is the one we just cut on the first pass. This is the one that I cut from re-rolled and reworked dough. This is the one I squished into the pastry cutter. And you can see that one's given the best rise. This one's still kind of okay, but it's a bit chaotic and lumpy. This one's just a mess. They'll all taste really great, but I don't think there's any question that that one is the lightest and nicest looking. And here we can see the difference between a plain egg wash and an egg wash with a little bit of cheese underneath it. I think it's worth adding that little bit of cheese just for that golden orange colour rather than tawny sort of brown, but maybe you prefer that, I don't know. And then also, this is what they look like with the chilli under. Now this one went a little bit too far and that chilli's toasted a little bit. I suspect that might taste a little bit burnt. That's the problem with putting the chilli on there. If your whole family likes chilli, you could just incorporate the chilli flakes into the dough. There is, so far as I know, no such thing as a savoury cream tea. So let's invent one. These scones are still warm from the oven. Not hot, but just warm. And so inside we can see slightly more bready sort of texture, but still quite tender. And that butter's just kind of melting into them. And I think we'll have on this some Castello blue cheese. I was going to say we can't have jam on that. Of course we could if we wanted. Cherry jam would probably go quite well with that. But actually I'm going to use my odds and ends pickle. Link in the video description and in this card to where I made this pickle. I mean, after all, pickle is kind of a savoury jam. So there we go, savoury cream tea, I suppose. That's very good. And it holds together a lot more than the crumbly scones that I made in the first part of this video. So you can see it, the dough has a bit more integrity, really, than the crumbly scones. Still quite crumbly, although we will find that the ones I made on the second rolling, and indeed that one that I made with all the little scraps at the end, will be a lot more bready. The less you work the flour, the more cakey the scone will be. The more you work the flour, the more bready it will be. But yeah, I hope you can see when you make scones this way and bake them a little bit higher, you've got a scone that's got a lot more integrity to be buttered and to be picked up with one hand and bitten without completely crumbling. So I think I'll just hand you back to cream tea shrimp now to wrap up the video. Well, there's no point doing it if you're going to do it by halves, is there? I always think a cream tea scone should be loaded. So really happy with those scones. They came out really light and crumbly. Really absolutely spot on. I'm really, really happy with those. I hope you'll check out Babatunde's video, which, as I say, is in the card and in the video description. And I hope that's been interesting. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.